Greetings, chosen lady, and all those who share our like faith. Today we're going to start the first of five, I guess, appendices um, to our series, the Single Sister Spiritual Support Series. We have finished the book of Second John, and I wanted to deal specifically with different categories of single ladies and some of the things that the Bible talks about. Okay, so if you don't mind today. I'd like to begin with widows, okay, because our widows are so precious to the Lord. Not that everyone um, who's not a widow isn't, or if you're not a woman, you aren't. But the thing is that a woman who becomes a widow and has sacrificed however much of her life to help her husband to be successful. Maybe she did not personally follow a career path as far as going to school and things like that. And she has spent time taking care of the household and managing it and advising her husband, whether he has his own business or is working a salary job somewhere. And then after many years, the kids are older, and then the husband passes away. Um, you know, God has a heart for a woman that goes through that. If you have spent your entire life taking care of the household, and then your husband is gone, and you're older in age, you're at the point where you might ask the question: should I even go back to school and start a career based on your age? Now, I'll tell you a story of a widow that is close to me, and that's my grandmother, my mother's mom. Her name is Hazel Jean Whitaker. She has since gone to be with the Lord. But my grandmother, pretty cool love story actually. She was from Mississippi, and she was on the train. And this is during the World War II days. My grandfather had been he went into the Navy, and he was headed north to Chicago in order to go to basically base training. And so he met my grandmother on the train, and he basically said, "I'm going to marry this woman," and he did. So my grandmother and grandfather got married, and after the war, he got some of the GI housing. If you've ever seen the small 2-bedroom, 1-bath, boxy type houses that you see in almost every city, that was special GI housing. And in his case, this was an all African American neighborhood of that kind of housing, and that's what he did. He bought a house in Memphis, and he went to Tuskegee Institute to learn tailoring, which he got that certification, and he started tailoring there in Memphis. And two children came out of that: my uncle Rodney and my mother. And when my mother was 4 years old, my grandfather Joseph developed a condition called aplastic anemia, which is fatal if you don't get a blood transfusion. And so this was, early 1950s, and I'm just speculating, for an African American male to get a blood transfusion back then probably would have been a challenging thing. And he died. My grandmother said it was a very rapid, deterioration, and he died. So, my grandmother told me, she couldn't go in and look at him anymore. She just sat outside of the room there in the hospital and just, cried. So, what did my grandmother do after that? She never married again. She lived as a widow all of her days, and she lived on his Social Security check. She worked a couple of odds and ends jobs here and there, but she pretty much paid that house off, and it still stands to this day. And she raised my uncle and my mother, and she served the Lord all of her days. She even walked everywhere. She didn't have a vehicle. She had a vehicle, but she didn't drive. So she ended up, my uncle ended up eventually getting a car, but back then I think she probably gave it away or sold it. She didn't drive. So that's my grandmother's story. So why do I begin with that? Because if you are widowed, in other words, you are married and your husband died, the first thing you have to do is determine, and this is pastoral advice, will I marry again? Now, if your husband died, say, on keeping it simple, on January 1st, 2023, there's no timeline that says, well, you got to decide if you're going to marry again, by January 1st, 2024. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that I consider widows in two categories. The category of I'm willing to marry again, and the category like my grandmother who said, I will serve the Lord all of my days, and just the Lord. And believe me, my grandmother, although she only had a 4 or 5 year marriage, about 5-year marriage, she dearly loved my grandfather. And, I used to go over to my grandmother's house because I obviously had never met my grandfather, but his Navy picture was in the house. A picture of him in a suit was in the house. His pipes were in the house. I used to pick his pipe up and say, Grandma, what's this? That's your grandfather's pipe. Joseph used to sit in that chair and smoke that pipe, So it was Joseph, my grandfather, was spoken of quite a bit by my grandmother, and that let me know how much she truly loved him, and she never really wanted to love anyone else. And there was a really nice man that would come by to do odds and ends jobs every now and then, and he would do roof work and things like that. And the rumor was that he'd do a job and say, okay, you're going to marry me now. And, my grandmother would always say no, but, she never married again. And you have to be able to be celibate your whole life to do that, because the Lord doesn't want us to be sexually immoral. So if you're widowed, that's the first thing to consider. And I know that we studied 2 John, but I'm actually going to go to 1 Corinthians 7 as I don my glasses here, drinking a little water, help things go well. 1 Corinthians 7 talks about relationships, and really I'm going to drop down. I don't know what I just did. There we go. When I drop down to verse 8, Paul says, now to the unmarried, all kinds of stuff going on. Just by the time you watch this, I'll be better. But pray for me anyway. So verse 8 says, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. I might as well just tell you, I have COVID right now. Okay, so went to the doctor today to tell me I had COVID, so that's why I'm recording this, because I'm still in my uniform. My brother, who's a photographer, said that the uniform gets more hits. What can I say? All right, so what about widows? Paul is saying remain unmarried. To remain unmarried is the higher calling. Why? Because you don't have to consult anyone to do the Lord's work. When you marry, you have to consult your husband, and if you're young enough as to where you're raising children, the husband and the kids are a factor in everything. Whereas like my grandmother, every time they did something at the church where we attended, she was there. There was no exception to that. And she would walk. It was, maybe 5-6 blocks from her, and she would just walk to worship. And so, or to whatever the event was, Vacation Bible School, special concerts, she'd come up on Saturday. She had the key to the building and she'd sweep, things like that. And my grandmother would often sing to the Lord, and I'd hear her singing when I'd be over at her house in the summertime, when my mother would, drop us off to go to work. I'd be sitting in the room just kind of playing, and my grandmother would be in another room and she'd be singing, and that let me know, I guess this is what she does, when she's by herself. She had a very strong relationship with the Lord. And so if you are able to serve the Lord without, burning with passion, as Paul says, that you're wanting to be with someone, very badly. If that's you, if you want to be with someone very badly, then it's okay to do so. To put yourself on the market. I'm trying to think, did he say something about the younger? There's another place, and I'll have to find it, that talks about um, maybe in First or Second Timothy. I'm not sure, but maybe I can find it. But it basically says they in the early church they took care of widows that were older, and this is Paul again writing. Paul said that the younger widows should work or maybe even get married and not burden the church. So the church was using part of their money to take care of the older widows because evidently in the Roman Empire they didn't have a Social Security program like we do today. That's what my grandmother lived off of, Social Security. But back then, the church was actually taking care of widows. But in this particular passage, which I'm not finding for you, shame on me, got the wrong Bible here that doesn't have the headings in it. But there's a program for widows that maybe it's First Timothy, where they talk about a certain age. Maybe it was 60, I think, where you're saying, hey, if you're under the age of 60, you should work or remarry. Let's see. Oh, here it is. Chapter 5, verse 9 of First Timothy. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the saints, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry.
We now pause for an unpleasant nose blowing. Thank you for your patience.
It's just the way it is. I'm going to be blowing my nose. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And they not only do they become idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things they ought not to. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. For they have in fact already turned away to follow. Some have in fact already turned away to follow Satan. So, and here's another verse. It says, if any woman who is a believer has widows in her family, she should help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. Okay, so I'm gonna stop right there. But basically, that's good housekeeping, so to speak. So the widows over 60 were taken care of if they had lived a faithful life. Now you can't just walk in off the street. You've been unfaithful to your husband. You haven't been a part of the church, and your husband did die, and then you just kind of walk in and say, hey, take care of me. Paul's saying that there's limited funds, so let's take care of the ladies who have been true to the faith. Okay, now this is again the first century. We read that, and you got to put that in the context for today. Okay, today, a lot of women, especially in America, they work and have their own income, and if they lose their husband, then the church shouldn't necessarily just give them a paycheck because they're a widow. If she's, can take care of herself and her husband had an insurance policy, then, yes, by all means, spiritually take care of the woman, but financially she can take care of herself. But let's say that, there was someone in your congregation that, was homeless and, had been homeless a very long time, but, married and living on the street. And that does happen. Some people are living out of their cars, and then the husband dies. Maybe it's a migrant worker or something, and then the lady has nothing, no Social Security, no job, no skills. That might be a good person today in 2023 if they're a faithful, person in the faith that believes and they're faithful to their husband, that might be a great person for the church to help take care of. And there's many ways to do that. And some churches have a much greater income than others to be able to do that. But in America, we tend to kind of think that everybody should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. I don't think that's a biblical concept. So if there are widows, know that they are precious in God's sight. And let's talk a little bit about the younger widows in the passage that I read to kind of close things out. With the younger widows, Paul says, because back then, again, there was not a, more than likely in the Roman Empire, for a Jewish woman, or maybe by this time, actually, in the Corinthian church, it was probably Jewish and Gentile church. So for a younger woman, if she was going to be taken care of by the church, then she doesn't have a husband, she didn't have any kids, so she's just got a lot of energy, and she's going from place to place, just, the church is taking care of me, so, I'm just, maybe getting into gossip and all kinds of things, and that's what Paul's talking about. They had a problem with that. And so, Paul's saying, hey, they can take this energy and put it into, getting married and things like that. And if you remarry after being widowed, there's no sin in that. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, there's some people who say, if I lose my spouse, and everybody will eventually lose their spouse unless you die at the same time, which is pretty rare, then, some people say, I'll never marry again. And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you can stay celibate after you become a widower or a widow. So let's review. Older widows, we should take special care in the church to take care of our older widows in whatever way needs to be done. It may not be financially, it might be otherwise, but as Paul said, if there are widows in your family, take care of them. Okay, and when my grandmother in her 90s developed a form of dementia, my mother took my grandmother into her house, and my mother's a believer also, right? My parents took her into her house, but my mother was the primary caregiver. My dad was, going off to work every day, but, my mother took care of her for a couple of years before she left this earth. So that's biblical. Don't burden the church with taking care of someone that you have it in your power to take care of. My parents made, good enough middle-class income to take care of that. They had a large enough house to bring her in, and they had multiple vehicles to get her where she needed to go or to get things. There was really no barriers to taking care of my grandmother. And, I have seen, unfortunately, widows not taken care of, and I'll tell this story, which is not favorable, but I used to work for an insurance company where I was in the customer service, and I won't name it because I might get in trouble for telling this story. But anyway, I worked for this insurance company. This lady I always get her on the phone, and she was always asking about prescriptions and things like that. And, she was kind of not understanding the healthcare system. And so I found out she was a widow, and I said, ma'am, can I come pay you a visit? That's probably a no-no in most companies, but I did pay her a visit to make sure that, her living conditions were acceptable, which they were. She was living in a high-rise facility. And I said, don't you have kids? And she said, I have several kids, but this was in Memphis. She said they moved to Chicago and other places, and I haven't seen them in years. So here's this lady that is barely understanding how the healthcare system works, what her rights and her benefits are, because she had, my memory serves me correctly, she had been paying for prescriptions, when she didn't have to, and that's what I was trying to get her to understand, and so she was a really nice lady, but if her family had taken care of her, she wouldn't have to be suffering, is my point, okay? So let's take care of our older widows in whatever way needs to happen. For our younger widows, maybe you'll be like my grandmother, and when you think about it, you say, I'll never marry again. I'll live a celibate life like my grandmother, Hazel Jean, did. Or you might say, eventually, I am willing to marry again. And when I went off to Operation Iraqi Freedom, unfortunately, many young women lost their husbands, one of which was a young lieutenant who lived up the street from me. He died by a sniper attack. It poked his head out of a tank turret, and he was shot and killed. Young believer. He was always on the front row and bringing troops to chapel services that I conducted. And she became a widow, but she eventually remarried. And it wasn't long, actually. Maybe a year later, she remarried, and she didn't do anything wrong because her covenant with her husband is released at death. And that's why when we have a wedding, we say until death do us part, as my wife walks in. Joyce talking about widows. Want to offer any advice? She's like, I'm zipping it. I'm not saying a word. Okay. Well, this is a good time to... She did that. This is a good time to end it. Thank you for being patient with my coughing and such. And I will be doing, 4 more. Single, never married, divorced, abandoned, and those who are married. All right? Have a great evening, afternoon, or morning. God bless you.